Okay. All right. Boker Tov, Chag Sameach. We're starting the new Masekhet Shabbat. Masekhet Shabbat is a lot longer than Masekhet Berachot and a lot more technical, but it's very, very practical. Now it's going to start out. There are a couple of just very brief intros we're going to have, which differentiates it somewhat from Masekhet Berachot, because in Masekhet Berachot, I think we're familiar with a lot of the content and the concepts of prayer and Shema and so on and blessings. When it comes to Shabbat, there's a lot of content and a lot of ideas that we might be less familiar with and require introduction. So, there are 39 prohibited melachot, or activities, creative activities on Shabbat. The 39th and last one is hotza'ah mireshut l'reshut, moving an object from a private to a public domain. That's called hotza'ah, taking out. It's the 39th of the 39 melachot that are listed much later in the Masechet, in the 7th parak, when the Mishnah gives us the 39 melachot. So, our Masechet, now, many people are unfamiliar with this concept of hotza'ah today because they have something called an eruv that allegedly, purportedly allows them to carry objects from their house to the street and vice versa. We've talked about this many times and need not revisit it today. But let's just imagine a world, as John Lennon would say, let's imagine a world without eruvin so that we can understand what's going on in the Masechet. Because if you try to imagine like what we have today, that everybody carries in and out of their house because there's an eruv, that they believe allows them to do so, then the Masechet won't make any sense. So we need to pretend that there are no eruvin, there's no special legal loophole to allow us to carry. So that's principle number one that we need to know, is that this is one of the 39 melachot on Shabbat, and just like any other melacha on Shabbat, such as cooking or lighting a fire or processing grain in various ways, any one of the melachot, or sewing or writing, so any of these melachot are equally severe in their consequence. The Torah says that somebody who violates Shabbat b'mezid, on purpose, the penalty is, if they have warning beforehand and witnesses, it's a death penalty. If they don't have witnesses and warning, it's karet, which is very serious. It's as serious as eating on Yom Kippur, being spiritually excised or cut off from the Jewish people or from the next world or even from this world, whatever karet exactly means. And then if it's by accident, then a person would bring a korban chatat. They would bring a sin offering in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. What is defined as by accident is either the person forgot what they were doing was not allowed on Shabbat, or they forgot it was Shabbat. You woke up in the morning and simply forgot that it was Shabbat and went about their usual routine. So whenever we see in the Mishnah the word chayav, he is liable for the violation, it means all of these things. It means if it was on purpose, he's liable for either excision in the divine punishment system or the death penalty in the human punishment system. And if it was by accident, then chayav means that a person who did this action would have to bring a korban chatat. So we want to be charitable and we want to be as positive as humanly possible. So we're going to always assume that the person's doing it by accident, right? So when it says chayav, we're going to assume that it means liable to bring a korban because we want to be nice. Okay, now let's take a look at the first Mishnah. With these ideas in mind, we can understand the first Mishnah, although most of the Magidei Shiur give much more lengthy and complex introductions to Masechet Shabbat. I think we'll learn as we go. So let's start the first Mishnah. Yitziot Shabbat, Shetayim Shein Arba. The goings out on Shabbat, literally that could be translated as the exiting on Shabbat, but Yitziot means hotza'ah, the carrying out of objects on Shabbat, are two, which are four. Bifnim, inside. Ushtaim shein arba bachutz. And there are two which are four to somebody who's standing outside. Now what the heck does this mean? Okay, we're going to see in a minute what it means, but basically what it's trying to get at is that there are two biblical violations one can commit if they're standing out inside, and there are two biblical violations one can commit if they're standing outside. Now, meaning that a person standing inside the house can either transfer an object from inside the private domain to the public domain, or he can take in an object from in the public domain and bring it into the private domain. In the same way, a person who's standing outside can either transfer an object from where he's standing, the public domain, into the private domain, or he can reach in and take something that's in the private domain and transfer it to the public domain. So, for instance, a person could take the trash out, a person could bring a newspaper in. Okay, now taking the trash out is more complicated because it might not be a biblical violation for other reasons, but let's leave that be. So, this is what we know so far. There are two ways we can violate She'en Arba, which are four. Meaning that there are two biblical violations and two rabbinically prohibited activities that come along with them. Now, just as a technicality, Hotza'ah literally means taking out from a private domain to a public domain. Hachnasa is the technical term for bringing something that's outside, inside. But oftentimes, just for shorthand, we call it all Hotza'ah. Sometimes we just summarize by calling it bringing out. Also, a private domain here is not defined by its use exclusively. It's defined by its physical properties. So, a house, even if it's open to, even if you are very generous and you open your house to the public all the time, it's still considered a private domain because it's walled and it has a structure. And the public domain, even if you live in a ghost town and nobody ever comes there, it still could be a public domain according to many Rishonim. And certainly, if it's well trafficked, it would be. So, what are the cases? Ketzad. He'ani omed b'chutz u'bal habayit bifnim. The poor person is standing outside, and the homeowner is standing inside. Pashat he'ani et yado lifnim, v'natan letoch yado shel bal habayit. The poor person stretches his hand into the house and puts something in the hand of the homeowner. Now, why would the poor person be giving the homeowner something? Shouldn't it be the opposite? Well, it could be a basket that he's giving him to fill with food. Or it could be his te'udah to prove that he's legit. Like a lot of the people who come to collect money. We don't know. Oh, sheratal mitocha ve'otzi. Or he took something out of the hand of the Baal Habayit and brought it into the public domain. So, he'ani chayav u'Baal Habayit patur. So in that case, clearly, the ani is the one who has committed the violation because he transferred the object. He picked up an object in the public domain and placed it in the private domain, or vice versa. He picked up the object in the private domain by reaching in, and he placed it in his public domain. So in either case, he did the entire melacha himself. What did the Baal Habayit do? What did the homeowner do? He didn't participate in this in any way. Now, there are three components to any transfer. One is called the akira, picking up the object. One is called hanacha, putting down the object. And then obviously there's the transfer. In order to be liable for carrying, you have to do both the akira and the hanacha. You have to pick up the object and you have to put down the object.
So in other words, the homeowner is not liable.
The homeowner was just standing there. He didn't do anything.
He has not picked up.
He didn't do anything because the poor person picked up the object and put it in his hands, or he took something from the private domain and put it in the public domain. Okay. The homeowner's just standing there.
But the Mishnah doesn't say that the homeowner picked it up.
Not yet. Not in this case. Okay? Or here's the other one. Pashat Baal Habayit et yado lachutz v'natan letoch yado shel ani. Let's say the Baal Habayit, the homeowner, stretches out his hand and puts something in the hand of the ani, like some money or something. Okay? Or let's say food, because money is muktzah. Okay? Or he took something out of the hand of the poor person and brought it in. Like let's say the poor person's holding a basket or something, then he's going to fill it with some food. So he takes the basket out of the hand of the poor person and he brings it in. So v'hichnis Baal Habayit chayav ve'ani patur. So in that case, the Baal Habayit, the owner of the home, is completely liable, and the ani is totally exempt because he did not do either the akira or the hanacha. He neither lifted the object from its place of rest, nor did he replace it or set it down in its new domain. So he is playing a passive role in that case. So the Baal Habayit is the one who's chayav. Now the Mefarshim ask here, like Tosafot for instance asks, the Ran asks, lots of Mefarshim ask, wait a second, isn't it still morally wrong? I mean, it's called lefnei iver lo titen mechshol. You're not supposed to enable or aid and abet somebody who's violating Shabbat. So how can we say that this homeowner is really not liable for anything? I mean, he's standing there letting the poor person take the object, or the poor person is standing there and allowing the Baal Habayit to move the object from the private to the public domain. So why are we letting one get off scot-free here? And basically, so the Tosafot tries to answer it and say that, well, maybe one of them is not Jewish or something like that. And, but the simplest answer is what the Ran says, which is we're not dealing with those halachot here. All we're talking about here is who is technically liable for the violation of Shabbat. Is the other guy morally culpable because he's aiding and abetting the violation of person number one? Sure, but that's not the issue of this Mishnah. This Mishnah is just trying to describe to you that transferring an object, for somebody to be liable for transferring an object, they had to do both the akira and the hanacha. They had to lift the object and put it in the new domain. Yes? You look puzzled.
But the Ani was still technically, unless, like Tosafot said, he's a non-Jew, he's still...
how did he carry it there to begin with?
He's still in violation of carrying something on Shabbat.
That's true, that's true. Good point.
That point in time.
That's true. Right.
He lives outside the window of the...
Right, he just sits there. He didn't move.
He sits there all the time.
Well, that could
he
be.
picked up something that was there.
We can envision many scenarios, but I think that the easiest way to understand this Mishnah is that it's isolating that moment and talking only about that moment. So we don't know what the Ani did before. We don't know what the Balabai did before.
But
the Balabai,
for the Balabai to grab something from the...
He had to have brought it there.
Yeah, he had to...
No, for sure. But so I think the simplest way to look at it is that we're just isolating that one moment. We're not looking at how he got there. Maybe that we don't know. Maybe the Ani drove up in the car before. We don't know.
Right.
Okay, but we don't know how he got there. We're just looking at that moment. Yeah. So Pashat Ani Yad. So now we come to the more complex cases. So we said there's Shtaim Shen Arba Bifnim, Ushtaim Shen Arba Bachutz. That the person standing inside can commit two violations that are biblical violations. So we saw that. Right? That was the Balabayit, either bringing something from his domain into the hand of the Ani or vice versa. And Shtaim Shen Arba Bachutz, we saw the two biblical violations of the Ani, of the poor person, either putting something into that private home or taking something out. What about the Shehen Arba? What's the four? In other words, what are the two cases in which there's a rabbinical violation but not a biblical? So now we're going to find that that's when they share the burden. Pashat ani et yado lifnim v'natal balabait mitocha. Oh, shenatan mitocha ve'otzi sheneim peturin. Okay, so what does it say? If the ani takes something and he lifts it from the public domain and he does this, but he didn't set it down, and the Baal Habayit takes it out of his hand and puts it down. So what happens there? The Ani did the Akira. He picked up the object in Rishut, in domain number 1, and the Baal Habayit set it down in domain number 2. Or, alternatively, or the Baal Habayit picked up something inside. The Ani was stretching his hand. He put it in the hand of the Ani inside. And the Ani, the poor person, takes it out and puts it down outside. So in those cases, either the Ani, the poor person, is picking up, and the Baal Habayit is putting down, or vice versa, the Baal Habayit is the one picking up, and the Ani is the one putting down. So they shared it. So then Sheneim Piturim, they are both exempt. Alternatively, Pashat Balabait Yitidol Lachutz v'Natale Ani Mitocha Shenatan Tocha V'Yechnis Sheneim Piturin. Similarly, if the Balabait, the homeowner, were to stretch his hand out, so he did the picking up inside, but it's the Ani that takes out of his hand and puts it down, or that the Baal Habayit stretches out his hand, the Ani picks something up and puts it in the hand of the homeowner, and the homeowner brings it in and puts it down inside. So in those cases, in other words, again, they're sharing the labor. One is doing the picking up in domain A, and one is putting down in domain B. So there, neither one has completed an entire melacha, so they are both exempt. Now you're going to ask the question, wait a second, what about in the beginning? Who was doing the picking up and putting down? Right. The answer is that in the first case, in the first case, when it says that the Ani picked something up and put it inside, it means he picked it up in the outside and he actually put it down inside.
Okay, so this is the
he stretched his hand out and he put it down on the table inside.
It's basically doing this.
Right. He's standing at the door.
Right. The permitted one is this.
Right. Well, it's not permitted, it's piturin. So whenever we talk in Masekhet Shabbat, now one of the things the Mefarshim say that's very important, now just as we said that chayav means that he's liable, either liable if it's on purpose for a severe penalty or by accident for a korban. Patur means patur aval asur, that you're not liable, but you're not allowed to do it. Okay? Mutar is the word that means permitted. Okay? Patur in Hilchot Shabbat See, in Dinei Mamonot or something, or in other areas where we say patur, we mean the guy's scot-free. That's he's off totally free. When we say patur here, we mean you can do it, but if you did it, we're only going to punish you on a rabbinical level, which is makat mardut. They would give you like a little bit of whipping. They beat you up a little bit, but they wouldn't hurt you too bad. Okay, so that's that's patur here, means you can't do it. Now, what do we see? So for each one, so of course, what ends up happening here is that you have a case. Now, the way that Rashi interprets this is one of the problems is which, in the case where they're both exempt, so which one are we crediting to which person? Because it really, in reality, there are two scenarios where the ani is liable, and two scenarios where the Baal Habayit is totally liable. And then there are two scenarios at the end, but really it's four scenarios. Okay, there are four scenarios. In each of them, both the ani and the Baal Habayit are exempt. Okay, how so? Because if the ani picks up and the Baal Habayit puts down, or the ani picks up or the Baal Habayit picks up and the ani puts down, so there are two ways that can happen. Okay, where they're sharing it, and in all of those cases, both of them are exempt. So there's really a total of 8 exemptions. If you look at the 4 cases, the two people, so really if they're both exempt in each one of the 4 cases, whether the Baal Habayit, in other words, he picks something up and the ani puts it down, okay, or the ani picked it up and the Baal Habayit put it down, or the ani or the Baal Habayit, in other words, whenever they're sharing it, there are 4 cases, because the 4 cases are the ani brings something in and the Baal Habayit puts it down inside, or the Baal Habayit picks it up and the ani puts it down, okay, or the Baal Habayit stretches out his hands and the ani takes it and puts it down. So in other words, it's really the same thing, but they describe one from the perspective of starting inside and one from the perspective of starting outside. So the question is, which one are we crediting to which? So that's a little bit complicated. The way Rashi says it is that whoever did the akira, in that case, whoever picked up the object first. So in the first case where it says the ani stretched his hand out and the Baal Habayit took from it, so who was the one who initially did the picking up? It was the ani. Okay? But when it says, or the Baal Habayit put something into the hand of the ani, and the poor person took it out, so then the Baal Habayit was the initiator. Okay? When it says that the Baal Habayit stretched out his hand and the ani took from it, that meant that the Baal Habayit was the initiator because he picked up the object and stretched out his hand. When it says that the ani put something into the hand of the Baal Habayit and the Baal Habayit brought it in, and that's how they shared it, so that would mean that the ani was the initiator. So he's really in that case, he's the one who's called patur, who's really called exempt in those cases.
And it's the initiator of the action, not of the intention, because otherwise,
right, exactly,
just putting the basket down, that would be counted
right
as initiation.
So there are actually three. There are actually three.
Action.
Right. There are actually 3 different ways you could do it, because it could be the person who stretches out their hands, right? Whether because they're initiating the action in terms of intention-wise, they're stretching out their hand, or it could be the one who picks it up first, or it could even be, you could say that's the one that puts it down. That we're saying he's exempt because you might have thought he was completing it, he would be liable. Right? So we're going to see more about this in the Gemara that's going to deal with this problem. But the Tosafot here asks the question of why did the Masekhet see fit to start with such an abstruse point? Okay? Well, why are we talking about this? About transferring objects from one domain to another? Why don't we start out with a nice introduction about the Shabbat or the basics of the Shabbat? So he gives 3 different answers. He says, first of all, he shows that in many other Masechetot, for example, Yomah, for example, Pesachim, talks about Pesach, we go in chronological order. We start with the things that happen on 7 days before Yom Kippur, and then the day before Yom Kippur, and then Yom Kippur itself. And Pesach, we start with the things that happen in advance, searching for chametz, and then we talk about the things that happen on Pesach. Okay, so why doesn't it follow the same order in this Masechet? So he basically gives a couple of answers. He says one possibility is that because there are so many halachot, as we're going to see later on in the Gemara's treatment of this Mishnah, there were so many principles derived from this Mishnah that it was a Mishnah that the Tana wanted to start with because it throws you in to a lot of the most interesting principles of Shabbat. As we're going to see, that's true. Another possibility is that that since it's a very common malacha, transferring objects is taken very lightly, so it's something that the Mishnah wanted to start with. A third and possibly most most cogent, I think, answer and easiest answer to accept is that what we're going to see is, in fact, that the Masechet does go into practical things, starting with Erev Shabbat. And one of the things it mentions is that you should be careful that you're not carrying things around from Friday when Shabbat comes. Because once Shabbat comes, if you're carrying those things, you're going to be carrying them be'isur, in violation of Shabbat. So, and it talks about some examples of that. So therefore, as an introduction to that pre-Shabbat preparation, so to speak, we start talking about this idea of carrying, because you're going to need to know that you can't carry, because that's probably the first thing you need to do when Shabbat comes, is to make sure that your pockets are empty. Okay? Now, the Gemara begins and says, Tanan Hatam, we learned over there, because there's a Mishnah, actually, that summarizes, in essence, several cases where we have this Shtaim Shein Arba. This is in Masekhet Shavuot, that talks about the various cases where we have the Shtaim Shein Arba, these two that are really four. So it says Shavuot, Shtaim Shein Arba. When it comes to oaths, there are two which are four. The two biblical oaths for which a person violating them is liable are when he swears for the future. He says, I'm not going to, or I'm going to. Lahara or lahetiv, it says. He either says, I'm going to eat, or I'm not going to eat. He makes an oath for the future. That's a future-oriented oath. If he violates it, he brings what's called the korban olevi ored. He has to bring a special type of korban, shein arba, but they're really four, because we expand it from the two future to the two past. That just as if he said, I will do X or I won't do X, he's liable. He's also liable if he says, I did do X or I didn't do X in the past. He's also liable. In other words, for saying a false oath. If he swears to the effect that he did something or didn't do something, and it wasn't true. We turn to Amud Bet. Yidiota tum'ah shetaim shein arba. Similarly, there are two which are four cases of awareness of impurity. What is this talking about? A person who is tamei and accidentally eats a holy object, like he eats holy food, terumah or a korban, without remembering that he was tamei, or he enters the Beit HaMikdash without realizing it. So the two cases are that he forgets that he was tamei and he eats the food that he knew was holy food, but he forgot that he was tamei, or he enters the Beit HaMikdash and he forgot that he was tamei and he entered it. But shehin arba, but there are four cases. So those are the two core cases that are really mentioned more directly in the Tanakh. What are the two cases expanded from that? Where a person remembers that they're tamei, but he forgot that this was holy food. Or he remembered that he was tamei, but he forgot that this area is a place where tamei people are not allowed to enter. So he forgot about the external case. He didn't forget about himself. So that's why it says Shtaim Shein Arba, and they're connected actually because the korban that you bring for accidental consumption of holy foods in a state of impurity, or for entering the Beit HaMikdash in a state of impurity, is the same as the korban you would bring for violating an oath that you made. So they're mentioned together. Mar'od negaim shenaim shein arba, and similarly, the appearances of tzara'at, of discoloration of skin, white skin, that make a person a mitzorah, are two which are four. There are two types of white that render the person tamei for sure, which are the avot, the head ones. One of them is called se'et, and one of them is called baheret. Se'et is the whitest of white. That one is the baheret is the whitest of white, which is as white as snow, just like Mary's little lamb. And the se'et is like the wool of a sheep, which is ironic given the example that I just gave. Apparently, the sheep does not have fleece as white as snow. The typical one.
Probably,
the typical one.
That was an albino sheep.
That's why that was so special. Well, that was genetically engineered. And then there are two toladot. There are two subsidiary colors. One which is the color of the sid ha'echal, the plaster of the hechal of the Beit HaMikdash, and the other one is the color of krum betza, of an eggshell. So you have different levels of whiteness. The discoloration would make you a mitzorah, tzara'at, the type of biblical leprosy. No, two.
Oh, two avot.
The sheep's wool, or the whiteness like snow. Those are avot, and then each one has a tolada. So the one that's white as snow, its tolada, its subsidiary is the one that looks like plaster, and the one that looks like wool, its subsidiary is the one that looks like an eggshell. Okay, so if let's say you had a little bit of the color of the snow, and then next to it, and part of the discoloration isn't that color, but it's actually the color of the plaster in the Beit HaMikdash, that would still combine together. Okay.
So that means they don't transfer to Av, but Avot transfer?
They do. They're equally significant, but it has to do with combinations.
Oh.
Toladot and Avot always have to do with combinations. Basically, on their own, the Tolada is just as significant as the Av. But when they're combined, Toladot can only usually combine with their own Av. Okay? Okay, and then we have there, Yitziot Shabbat Shtaim Shein Arba. So there in the Mishnah and Shavuot, it doesn't say Shtaim Shein Arba inside, Shtaim Shein Arba outside. It doesn't say there are 2 violations which can be expanded to 4 inside, and 2 cases which can be expanded to 4 for somebody standing outside. It just says there are 2 cases that can be expanded to 4. Why is that? So why is it that here we say, actually, a total of 8 cases? We say there are 2 cases of liability for the person standing inside, plus 2 cases of rabbinic prohibition for the person standing inside. And we said there are 2 cases of biblical liability for the person standing outside, plus 2 additional cases of rabbinic liability for the person standing outside. But over there, why is it that over there they only say Shtaim Shein Arba? That there are 2 cases of biblical liability expandable to 4. Why is it? So, Hachad Ikar Shabbatu Tanei Avot Tanei Toladot. The answer is that since over here, the main subject of Masekhet Shabbat is the laws of Shabbat. So we give you the full treatment. We talk about the avot, and we talk about the toladot. We talk about the primary prohibition, and we talk about the secondary prohibition. Hatam delavikar shabbatu, avot taneh, toladot lo taneh. Over there, where it's just a summary of various different situations in halacha, where there's this concept of 2 and another 2 which are 4, 2 primary cases expandable to 2 additional cases. So it doesn't give you the full fleshed out version of Hilchot Shabbat. It just gives you a summary. And avot ma'inihu yitziot v'yitziot tirei havyan. And what are the avot? The avot are yitziot, bringing out. Because according to the way the Gemara has it, bringing from a private domain to a public domain is the av melacha. That's the primary melacha. Bringing from the public domain into the private domain is the tolada. It's the secondary malacha. So even though they're equal in status in terms of biblical violation, they're equal. But in terms of the status that they have in other respects, basically, if somebody does what's called tolada b'makom av, he does an av and a toladat once, he's only liable for 1. Okay, so the hachnasa, the bringing in, is considered a tolada because as the Gemara is going to mention much later, they derive it from an inference. They don't derive it directly from a verse in the Torah. So, what is it saying? In Shavuot, where it says that the prohibitions on Shabbat are 2 which are 4. It means there are 2 ways you can do hotza'ah, taking out. Because the Mishnah there is only talking about the primary malacha, which is going from the private domain to the public. So there are 2 ways you can take out, which are expandable to 2 ways you can take out rabbinically that are prohibited. So there are 2 biblically prohibited ways of taking out, meaning when you do the entire thing yourself, either you're standing inside and you transfer the object to the outside, or you're standing outside and you take from the inside and bring it outside. And there are also 2 ways that are rabbinically prohibited, which is where the person inside picks up and the person outside puts down. Okay, depending on depending on how it's done, you can have 2 different ways. So depending on who's liable for it, so either the ani is the one who transfers from inside to outside, or the balabait is the one that transfers from inside to outside, but they're sharing the malacha in that case. And through their sharing, they transfer the object from inside to outside. But basically, in Masekhet Shavuot, it's only dealing with the case where the object moves from inside to outside. Either where one person's completely responsible for it, or where the two are sharing the process of transferring the object from inside to outside.
Is the Tolada the biblical?
It's still biblical.
The rabbinical?
No, because the one in Shavuot is not talking about the
there
rabbinical.
are three, basically the Melacha, the Tolada, and the rabbinical.
Right.
The three,
right.
Three.
So the one over there is only talking about the primary Melacha, and it's two rabbinical cases, permutations. It's not talking about bringing an object from the outside to the inside, which is considered a secondary biblical violation, but secondary. Okay? So the Gemara says, V'chite ma'mein l'chiyuv u'mein l'tur v'adumyot de mar'ot negaim katane. But there's a problem here, because there are only two cases where you transfer an object from inside to outside. That's why it says Yitziot Turei Havyan. There are only two cases where you transfer from inside to outside. V'chite ma'mein l'chiyuv u'mein l'tur. So maybe you're going to say that what is Masechet Shavuot counting? Like what I just said. That it's counting the two cases where somebody transfers an object from inside the house to outside, okay? And it's counting the two cases where the malacha is shared, so nobody's liable, but the object winds up getting from the inside to the outside, okay? But that cannot be what Masechet Shavuot is talking about, because it put it together with these other cases where all four things are a matter of liability. That just like the other things listed there, like the two types of oaths that are future oaths, which are four if you count the two that are past oaths. There are two kinds of discolorations of skin, which are four if you count the two additional subsidiary ones. But in all these cases, they're all equal in liability. So why would you say that when it says there are two ways of carrying an object, which are four, that it means two of them you're liable and two of them you're not? That doesn't make any sense. Ela Amar Papa says, Hachadikar Shabbatu Tanei Chiyuve Upturei. Hatan Tlavikar Shabbatu Chiyuve Tanei Upturei Lo Tanei. So how it answers is like this: that in our Masechet, the main subject is Shabbat. So we're still going with that as the differentiating factor. Over there in Masechet Shavuot, whatever is mentioned about Shabbat there is just an aside. It's not the main topic. Here it's the main topic. So what do we have? We have two cases that are four for the person inside and two cases that are four for the person outside. The two cases which are four for the person inside are two cases where they're liable and two cases where they are not biblically liable, only rabbinically. And the two cases which are four for the person standing outside, two of them they're liable biblically, and two of them they're rabbinically liable, which is saying patur. They're exempt from biblical liability. Okay? So here we have a total of 8 cases, because 4 of those cases are non-liability cases. But in Masechet Shavuot, where the topic is not Hilchot Shabbat, we don't want to talk about cases where you're not liable. That's a technicality for the laws of Shabbat. Okay, so what is it going to mention there? Only the two which are four, meaning the two cases which are four where you're liable in all of them. Because out of the 8 cases in our Mishnah, 4 of them are full liability. The one where the Balabayit takes an object from his domain outside, the one where the Balabayit takes from the outside inside. That's 2 cases. Well, the one where the poor person takes from his domain inside, the one where the ani takes from the inside outside. So where he's totally liable. There are 4 cases of total liability. Okay, so therefore, when the Masechet Shavuot, the Mishnah Masechet Shavuot says there are 2 cases on Shabbat which are 4, it means there's a total of 4 cases of liability. When you combine both the poor person and the ani, there are 4 cases of liability. I'm sorry, the poor person and the homeowner, there are 4 cases of total liability. Whereas in our case there were 8 cases because 4 of them are exemptions. Okay, so chiyuvei mainihu. And what are the cases? You're saying that over there, in Masechet Shavuot, it's only talking about cases of liability. What do you mean by liability? Yitziot, taking out. Yitziot tarte have them, but you still have the problem. There were only 2 cases where taking an object from inside the house to outside the house brings liability. One is where the homeowner brings from inside to outside, and the other one is where the poor person brings from inside to outside. Where are you getting 4? Shtayim dehotza'ah, shtayim dehachnasah. So there are 2 of taking out and 2 of bringing in. V'hayitziot katane. But what about the fact that Masechet Shavuot uses the same term here? Yitziot, taking out. So we're looking for 4 cases of taking out. So what's the answer? Amar Rav Ashi, Tana Hachnasa Nami Hotza'a Karela. That we call Hachnasa also Hotza'a. Because even when you bring something in, you're taking it out of its current place, of its current domain. Something might be outside and you bring it inside. But really you took it out of its current domain and you put it in a new domain. Mimai, how do we know that that's true? Miditznan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Hamotzi Bereshut Lereshut Chayav. Because it says in the Mishnah, one who takes out from one domain to another is liable. Milo askinan dekama'ayel mireshut harabim l'reshut hayachid v'kakarela hotza'a. And we know that Mishnah is referring, as we'll see when we get there, okay, that it's referring certainly to bringing from the outside in. Because look at our Mishnah. What's the first case? And our Mishnah talks about bringing from the outside in. And it calls it yitziot. It calls it taking out. Because you're taking out from its current place and bringing it into a new place.
Why do they call it yitzia or hachnasa? Why can't they call it whatever the word transfer?
We're going to see that that's the word of the pasuk. That's the language of the pasuk. It says.
That's what you said.
Right, because it says
Yitzia is the same thing.
Ali yotzi, because it says yotzi is the term in the Torah where it refers to it. So they use the biblical language. That's the reason that they gave.
Oh.
Yeah. So in any case, it's all the same. And we call it V'tamamai kol akirat chefetz mimakomo tana hotza'a karela. The reason is because any removal of an object from its current location is called hotza'a, taking it out of that location, even if what you're doing ultimately is bringing it in. So therefore, we really have 4 cases of hotza'a, even though 2 of them are bringing in and 2 of them are bringing out. It doesn't matter. Matnitin namitika. We can also see that from our Mishnah itself, because the katane yitziot v'kamefarish achnasa l'alta. Because it says yitziot Shabbat, that there are bringing out on Shabbat. There are 4 cases, right? Or there are 2 cases which are 4 and 2 cases which are 4. And what's the very first case that we discuss? The ani puts his hand inside and puts something in the hand of the balabayit. What's the first case of taking out is actually bringing in, because the poor person is putting something inside. So we see that taking out doesn't mean the ultimate destination. It means actually that the object is being moved. Okay? So therefore, Shemamina, there we learn. Rava Amar Rishuyot Katane. Rava says actually you could interpret the word Yitziot differently. Not as taking out, but as Rishuyot, as domains. There are 2 domains on Shabbat. Rishuyot Shabbat Shtayim. That the Rishuyot, the domains on Shabbat are 2 which yield 4 prohibitions. So Rava says there's Rishut Yachid, the private domain, and a public domain, which create 4 prohibitions for a person standing inside and 4 prohibitions for a person standing outside. Because a person who is standing inside can either transfer an object out or transfer it in completely, or he can participate in the transferring out or in. So therefore he has 4 prohibitions that fall upon him. And similarly, the person who's standing outside, who can either completely be responsible for a transferring in or out, or he can participate in a transferring in or out. So therefore there are a total of 4 cases that apply to the person outside and 4 cases that apply to the person inside. But Yitziot are being used for the in the sense of reshut, which is a use that's actually, which you find totzaot in the, like it'll use the word totzeotav. The borders are called totzaot in the Torah sometimes, because it makes reference to a specific domain. So we could say here that Yitziot Shabbat Shtayim means that there are 2 domains that are relevant on Shabbat for the person standing inside. And there are 2 domains that are relevant on Shabbat for the person standing outside. And in each case, the relevance is that they yield 4 different prohibitions. Now again, which prohibition is being accredited to which is a little bit complicated. In the biblical ones, we understand that a person standing inside can either move an object from inside to outside or from outside to inside. A person standing outside can do the same. Either move something from outside to inside or vice versa. But when it says that 2 of the rabbinic violations apply to the person inside, and 2 of the rabbinic violations apply to the person outside, which 2 are applying to which? So Rashi wanted to say that it's the picking up of the object that is when you're exempt. The only difficulty is, if that's the case, it's a little bit complicated, because the poor person, when he picks up an object outside, and then the person inside sets it down, okay? that's a case where he can share the malacha and we could say he's exempt in that case, right? Because the person inside set it down. But when the person inside if the person inside picks it up inside, and he sets it in the hands of the poor person, and the poor person sets it down outside, okay? So then the balabayit is doing a hotza'ah in that case, according to Rashi, because the balabayit, the homeowner, initiated the transfer of the object outside. Okay, and the poor person can initiate but not complete a transfer of an object inside. Okay? Because in either of those cases, the person who's initiating it, who starts the process, is the one that we say is exempt. Okay, is getting an exemption in that case.
But I thought we said both people are...
Both people are exempt, but the question is, which one of them when we say shtaim shein arba? Because if there are 8 cases, and we're saying 2 of the biblical violations, we know that. So which 2 of the rabbinical obligations are we saying are make up the 4 for the poor person? Which 2 of the rabbinic violations are making up the 4 for the homeowner? Which one of the cases is which? So that's a little bit complicated. So what Tosafot wants to say, which seems to be the simplest way of reading it because it's just easy to say it, okay, is that in the second case is whoever stretched their hand out. All right? Whoever stretched their hand out. So there's a stretching of the hand out where the poor person picked something up outside and stretches his hand inside, and then the homeowner sets it down, sets the object down. Or where the poor person stretches out his hand, the homeowner picks something up inside, puts it in the hand of the balabayit, puts it in the hand of the poor person, and the poor person sets it down outside. So those 2 cases we say, even though the poor person was the one who stretched out their hand inside, he's still exempt. And in the case where the homeowner stretched out his hand, there are 2 cases. There's the one where the homeowner picked something up inside, stretched out his hand, and the poor person sets it down outside. There we're saying that's exemption number 1 for the Baal Habayit, for the homeowner. And there's the case where the homeowner stretched out his hand, okay, and the poor person put something in it that he had picked up from the outside, and the Baal Habayit set it down inside. So in that case, the Baal Habayit is being called exempt in that case, because he's the one that did the transferring, basically, because he's the one that stretched out his hand. So that's the way Tosafot understands it. That's why only 2 of the cases are credited to the Baal Habayit as exemptions, and only 2 of them are given to the ani, to the poor person, as exemptions. Not all 4 to both, because that would make it really each person in 4 cases is exempt.
Yeah. Well, I thought that's what we said initially.
No, because that would make 6. Because that would make it 2 cases where they're liable and 4 cases where they're exempt each.
So essentially, the liability is in putting the object down. That's where that's completing the.
That's when it would happen. But you had to have done the entire thing to be totally liable. You had to have picked up the object and put it down to be totally liable.
If you have not put it down,
nothing has happened yet.
Nothing has happened yet,
right.
And you're exempt.
You haven't done anything yet.
Because if you both stretch your hand and bring it in, you're still exempt.
You're still exempt because you didn't pick it up outside.
Because you took it from the hand. But
if you had picked it up outside and brought it in, like somebody left a package outside your door, you picked it up and you brought it in. As opposed to the UPS man picked it up, handed it to you, and you brought it in and put it down.
That's exempt.
That you would be exempt.
Okay. But if the UPS guy put it down
and you picked it up and you put it down inside, now you did the complete malacha.
But if you gave a package to the UPS guy,
right? So that would be the same thing. Because if you pick it up inside. And you stretched out your hand and gave it to the UPS man. He took the package and put it down, so he completed the malacha. You didn't complete it.
So that's how we're defining it. We're saying who completes the malacha itself? Who the final action?
Well, in all these cases, you're exempt because you didn't. You have to have done the entire thing from beginning to end to be liable. The only question is, if you take the cases of shared malacha, there are actually 1, 2, 3, 4 cases where they shared, which means, in theory, there are 8 exemptions because when they share, right? Because you can flip it around.
Yeah, but why would Ani be in the house of the Baal Habayit and the Baal Habayit be in the?
There wouldn't be. But in other words, the point is that in each case where they shared it, they're both exempt, right? So there's the case where the poor person stretched his hand out and either brought something to the Baal Habayit, which the Baal Habayit put down, or took something from the Baal Habayit, which he put down outside. Yeah. And then vice versa, where the Baal Habayit either stretched out his hand with something in it, and the poor person put it down, or the Baal Habayit stretched out his hand, the poor person picked something up and put something in it, and the Baal Habayit brought it in. Okay? So in all 4 of those cases, they're both exempt because nobody did the complete thing. Right. The only thing is that the Mishnah is saying that there are 4 exemptions. In other words, there are 2 exemptions for the poor person and 2 exemptions for the Baal Habayit. So why aren't there 4? Because there are actually 4 cases where they shared the malacha.
Right, because those are not complete.
Right, which are incomplete. Right. There are 4 exemptions for the poor person and 4 exemptions for the Baal Habayit. So the question becomes, which ones are we crediting to the Baal Habayit as exemptions and not factoring the poor person in at all? So we're just counting it as 2 for the Baal Habayit, and which are we counting as just 2 for the poor person? Okay, and that's really what the Gemara is going to take up now. Because Amar le Rav Matan Abayev Hatemane Havyan, there are really 8 cases in the Mishnah. Okay, Tartesere Havyan, right? They're not 8 cases. They're really 12 cases, which is what we just said. There are not 8 cases, 4 inside and 4 outside. There are really a total of 12 cases because they're in the 4 cases where they share the malacha. Each one is participating. So there are 2 cases where only the ani is liable, 2 cases where only the homeowner is liable. That's 4. But then there are 4 shared cases. So you have to take 4 exemptions apply it to the poor person and 4 exemptions apply it to the owner, because in both cases they're both involved in sharing. Right. Okay? So that's what he says. And uleta'amech shitzerei havyan. So he answered him and said, but according to you, there were 16. Why 16? What do you mean 16? Oh, because in the case where the Baal Habayit does nothing, in other words, where the poor person does the entire malacha, so there were 2 cases of that, right?
But they're not discussing that.
And there were 2 cases where the homeowner does the entire malacha and the poor person is just standing there, right? So in those cases also it's 16. So according to you it shouldn't be 12, it should be 16. In other words, there's in the 4 cases, the 2 cases where the poor person is completely liable, either because he brought something out or he put something in. So why don't you also count that as 2 exemptions for the homeowner? Because he didn't do anything. And in the case where the homeowner did the entire job, so why don't we say that the poor person gets 2 exemptions, right? So that would be a total of 16 cases. So that's exactly Amar le halokashya, no problem. Because bishlam abava deresha patur mutar lo katane. Because there it's patur mutar, meaning he didn't do anything at all. We can't say he's exempt. He didn't do anything. The homeowner is just standing there. But in the latter 4 cases, they both participated in sharing the job. So how can we say that one is getting it's counted as only 2 exemptions for instead of 4 for each? So mi'ika b'kulei Shabbat patur mutar. Really? Is that true? Are you telling me that the first case the guy is exempt and he's totally not liable at all? It's mutar. It's allowed. V'amar Shmuel kol p'turei d'Shabbat patur aval asur bar me'anei tlat patur mutar tzedat tzevi v'tzedat nachash u'mapitz mursa. Shmuel said that there are only 3 cases in all of Hilchot Shabbat where the word patur means allowed. One of them is to pop a blister on Shabbat. One of them is to trap a snake that could potentially harm you on Shabbat. And one of them is to trap a deer, which means there's a deer in the house and you're allowed to close the door, even though you're effectively trapping the deer, because you're not doing it to trap the deer, you're just doing it to close your door. Okay? So so there are 3 cases where the word patur means allowed. But this is not one of them. So in the first case where it says that the poor person did the entire job, the first 2 cases, or where the Baal Habayit did the entire job, and it says that the poor person is exempt, we should credit that as an exemption. We should call that 2 more exemptions. So what does the Gemara say? It says, Ki itzarech le Shmuel piturei de ka'avid maaseh. Piturei de ka'avid maaseh ikatuva. So the answer is that in a case where a person did something, there we say that anytime it says you're exempt, it means you're exempt but you're not allowed to do it. Except for 3 cases where you're exempt and you're allowed to do it. But in this case, the Baal Habayit is just standing there. He didn't do anything. The poor person took something and put it in the Baal Habayit's house. Or the poor person took something from the Baal Habayit's house and put it outside. Or the homeowner took something from outside, brought it in, or the homeowner took something from inside, brought it out. The poor person just standing there. Why should we say exempt? Exempt doesn't mean it's allowed. What do you mean it's allowed? He didn't do anything. What's allowed? Standing there is allowed? Okay, he didn't do anything. So, but still, Nikomakom Tartes Rei Havyan. But you still have to admit that in the 4 cases where they share the job, where they shared the malacha and it was done between the 2 of them, when it says exempt, why isn't it 4 exemptions for the poor man, 4 exemptions for the homeowner? Why is it only 2 for each? Answer. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop for today. But what it means is like this. That when it says patur and it's something where the person could have become liable as a result, that's where we count it. When it says patur and it's not a case where he could have become liable, we don't count it. So according to Rashi, what this means on the side, he says, Kigon akirot she'en techilat ha'melacha. It means the picking up, which is the beginning of the melacha. How so? Because maybe he's going to complete the job. In other words, to whom do we credit the exemption? To the person who picked it up but didn't put it down in the new domain. So whichever case we're talking about a case where, any case where the ani picked it up and the balabayit was the one who set it down, we say the ani, the poor person, is the one who's exempt in that case because he could have become liable if he had completed the job. And any case where the balabayit, the homeowner, picked up the object, but the poor person completed the job, there we say the balabayit is the one that's considered exempt because he started the process but didn't finish it. Okay? That's why we say that. But the person who just set it down, he couldn't have ever been liable because he didn't start the process. He wasn't there for the beginning of the process of the picking up.
Okay, so they consider whatever is relevant is whoever starts a process, then we describe the rest.
Right.
But whoever did not start it is irrelevant.
Right, and then he goes on to say, V'rabotenu omrim, Rashi says that some say that what it means here is like what I mentioned before, which is what the Tosafot says. That the ones that are counted are the ones where they stretched out their hand. So you could say the transferer is the one. Because the transferer, okay, the person who effectuates the transfer, the person who stretched out his hand. So there were 2 cases, he says, and that's even better, a better way to learn it, because then it's more balanced. Because the 2 cases where the ani stretches out his hand, and then it says patur, okay, and then when it talks about the balabayit, the homeowner stretching out his hand and they're patur. So he says that's what it means, that the one that did the transfer could have been liable had he had the complete melacha. Either the picking up is lacking or the putting down is lacking. Okay, so either what we're saying is that whoever did the akira, whoever did the picking up, but not the putting down, is the one that's getting credit, so to speak, for being exempt here. Or, and that's why it says 2 which are 4. There are 2 cases of complete liability for the poor person, and 2 cases where he picks up but doesn't put down. And there are 2 cases of complete liability for the balabayit, and 2 cases where he picks up but doesn't put down, and is therefore exempt from the biblical liability, but rabbinically culpable. And then there are, or according to Tosaf, the second opinion in Rashi, which is also Tosafot's reading, there are 2 cases where the poor person completes the job and is liable, and 2 cases where the poor person does the transfer of the object, but is not liable because either he didn't do the picking up or the putting down. And there are 2 cases where the homeowner is completely liable, and 2 cases where the homeowner did the transferring but is not biblically liable because either he didn't do the picking up or the putting down. So this is the 2 basic ways of learning the Mishnah, and we will continue here. Well, we'll continue on the next daf, because the daf for Shabbat is we're not going to be together, but we'll continue on Daf Dalet on Sunday. Be'ezrat Hashem, on Hoshana Rabbah. Have a great day. Chag Sameach.